Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chai Side Chat Season 2 Special Roundtable Edition. This is an exclusive interdisciplinary talk show featuring interviews with folks about creativity, the arts, healing, personal growth, spirituality, identity, and mental emotional well-being, to mention a few. I am your host, Aishwarya Subramanian, and for today's roundtable, I have with me three immensely talented Indian dancers who perform and present innovative work in both solo and group formats. As artistic directors of their respective dance companies, these artists create tapestries of movement choreography and storytelling that showcases, bridges, and transcends the traditional and the modern. Here's hoping for a dynamic discussion with these dancers on what drives their creativity and artistic processes inside and outside the studio. Please welcome Sonali Skandan from Jiva Dance, Preeti Vasudevan from Thresh, and Nadhi Thekkek from Nava Dance Theater. Hello, ladies, and welcome to our Chai Side Chats Roundtable. It is such a pleasure to have you all together, and thank you so much for being here. So I wanted to start with a question about solo versus group choreography, since all of you are dancers who perform and create work pretty extensively in both of those kind of arenas. So I'd love if we could just start by talking about maybe some of the differences and similarities in your approach and your process when you're making solo work versus group work, and even maybe differences in like themes and content that you explore when it comes to that. Anybody want to start?
I guess I can start. um, so, I guess originally when started my training in Bharatanatyam, you only train in a one way. It's a very solo focus, at least in my training, my experience, very solo focused, very, I trained with teachers who are very classical, very traditional, would present the work in this way. However, a lot of the experiences that I sort of developed from was group experiences. So you went from solo to group choreography in Bharatanatyam, and that was kind of a natural progression because the audiences demanded it, the presenters demanded it. So for me, I kind of developed my training in both ways, solo as well as group work. And and the teachers I had, I guess, never really presented it as a different way of looking at work, at choreography. I think that I learned from watching more dance, from watching dance in New York and watching modern dance companies, contemporary dance companies work, ballets work, how they work with space, how they work with staging, how they work with transitioning and the music as well. So that kind of influenced me a lot. So when I started my company, Jiva Dance, I really felt kind of energized and compelled to take work, and we started with restaging work that I already had in my repertoire, and that was kind of a natural progression to work with choreography, restaging multiple bodies. How do multiple bodies interact with each other? How does the stage present itself? How does the stage open up itself when you have more than one body on stage? And then eventually it progressed into new choreographies, new ideas, new work, and then also incorporating other forms of movement into the choreography and how that might interplay in the themes and the concepts that I had envisioned. So I think it's for at least for me, it's been a progression, taking solo work, expanding it to group work, and then finding the inspiration to create new work and add different movement ideas and different movement explorations in the work. Since pandemic, I've been really, forced in a way to look at my own self and my own body and my own work and kind of re-energize myself as a soloist. And I feel like that was kind of also a natural progression for me. So we all go through phases. We all go through our kind of preferences and our inspirations. And right now I feel like I'm at that phase where I just want to sort of look at myself and figure out what stories, what do I want to say through my dance. And so I'm not saying it's neither here or there. I think for us, and as maybe I'm speaking as far for myself, it's how I feel. So solo versus group or both, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think you can, and be both, and it's what you're inspired by, really, at that moment.
I was listening to Sonali talk, and I think my experience was quite the opposite. I think the school that I grew up dancing Bharatanatyam in San Jose was all about group productions. And my teacher, Sundar Aunty, she went to Kalakshetra, and so I think that group production was always a big part of our childhood, and that was always fun for me growing up. And so I couldn't imagine Bharatanatyam for a long time as a solo. I was just not as exposed to solo performances. I mean, my parents were not that into dance or arts in general. The only exposure to dance I had was through dance class. And so I only really learned about the solo. I mean, I did my Iron and everything, and I saw many Iron but I had not even seen the touring artists who had come through the US, or I had never been to India to the season to see solo performances. So that idea was really became clearer to me, or was revealed to me when I was in my 20s. And so in that sense, group work was my go-to in terms of creation. And once I started making work with my friends, when we founded Nava in, I think, 2012, I mean, I loved that process. I loved seeing movement on other bodies, and I loved sort of sculpting it to say what I wanted it to say. And I really loved the process of directing dancers to really bring out a certain narrative in their bodies and in their movement, and really using all of our experiences to create the story, whether it's linear or not. And that experience, I think, is really addicting for me. And Aishwarya knows this already, that I love being in studio with other dancers. And I don't always need to be the one dancing. And in fact, many times I'm not. And that process is really, I sort of live for that process. The solo part came later. And I think once I started learning with a different teacher, Lakshman Master, I think his whole perspective was very, very different, in the sense that group is fun, yes, but what are you saying as a dancer? What are you bringing out for the audience? The audience isn't you don't shortchange them. You need to bring out your most authentic self in your performance. And he said it in a different way, but that's what I got from how he taught. And I think that has dictated a lot of other work. So as I'm making group work on one hand, on the other hand, there is a lot of solo work happening, and all of that I think comes from what I believe is the truth that needs to come out of my body, and right now that is the experiences of my parents or immigrants who came, after the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, and looking at their labor. And that's the story that's speaking to me right now. And I know that I won't be able to move on until I make this piece. So I think a lot of that is sort of that, like Sonali said, is a feeling, but there's this sort of visceral need to complete this process and complete a thought about a particular idea or an inquiry. And so in this instance, it's a solo, and I know that I won't be able to move on until it's finished. So I think that's a lot of how I look at what inspires, whether it's a group or a solo. It's this inquiry and what drives this process to completion, to an idea that we're sharing. That's me.
It's lovely to hear both of you share your views on solo and group. Well, from my perspective, I grew up in India. So, the notion of growing up in India, where both solo and group just live an everyday normal life, the chaos of both are there, was just in a more sort of stylistic and heightened way in a dance studio. And the thing about it is that, I learned from gurus like the Dhananjayans. So for them, grooming the artist as a group dancer and soloist went hand in hand. They both were very distinct, but also groomed you to think in very parallel lines too. They have a lot of similarities, but they are quite distinct in my book, and the way I grew up trained as a professional Bharatanatyam dancer. I bring this up because the soloist has to control the room, has to be in charge of everything, including the orchestra. The relationship between the soloist and the orchestra is really like battle of equals. It's great fun. It's like an amazing jam that goes on. You also have the room to improvise within a certain structure. So the way you captivate and capture your audience is very much under your control, which means that your deeper understanding of the nuances of the form itself and the aesthetics connected to it and the sentiments connected to it are much greater in demand and much more of a deeper reflective journey. The group, on the other hand, is very much connected to the way you can become invisible. Solo, you can't. In a group, you simply have to be the lines and points in space, and then so that you can emerge as a solo pointer line or whatever the choreographer there demands you, the production demands out of you. It's also thematic in many ways. Like Nadhi was saying, it doesn't have to be necessarily linear, but it could have its own journey of forming a narrative. And you're just one of those many, colors or paint marks on that canvas in a group work. But also solo and group demand very different kind of production values. And to understand what those production values need, what the demands of those are very, very valuable to the performer. But if I were to speak as a choreographer, I think it's, having had enough practical experience in both really allows you to go deeper into your choreographic practice and really understand bodies in space and how to become almost like a potter or a sculptor to create these multiple forms, understanding, proportions, dimensions, just very architectural sort of ways of looking at things as well. And then where do you plant the core narrative in it? So it's very much a director's job in many ways. So when I perform as a soloist, it's very different from when I create a solo for a performer. So as a choreographer, there are many ways. I'm pretty much cross-trained at this point. So I can experiment in my body many things. So finally, when I create a solo in my own body, the sum of all the experiences that it gives is very different from when I set it on another dancer and I have to tap in or seek what their body can do. It's like getting a new piece of clay and figuring out what this is made of. And that to me is very exciting, just the differences between those two. And as far as the group work is concerned, because I grew up in India in a society where, I was immersed in classical dance, but I was equally immersed in Western dance as well. So when I come here and I see the ways of group work and solo works happen, it just takes me right back to my training back in India, my classical, and then my own company, Thresh, because we work very collaboratively with many different kinds of artists, contemporary artists and ballet and Indian as well. So it's those trainings that I've received from a long time ago, are like little gems, that sort of little guiding stars that take me to the next level of what I create here.
Yeah, thank you all so much for sharing that. I think some of what y'all touched on actually leads me to my next question about tradition, which I know is like such a big word. And especially when we think about Bharatanatyam or just Indian classical art forms in general, I think that's a word, tradition is a word that comes up as an association for a lot of people. So I'm curious kind of how each of you conceptualizes that word in the context of your form and your work and how your own artistic and aesthetic sensibilities are kind of inform your choices to contemporize either within the form or beyond the form or beyond tradition. I know that's kind of a big question, but just wanted to put it out there.
So I'll start again. So I grew up in this country. I was born in India. Actually, I moved here when I was about 5. And I moved at a time in this country in history when there were very few Indians, a place there were very few Indians. I learned English by watching Sesame Street. I was in a school where I was the only person of color, and a time where it was people were allowed to say, "Oh, are you an Indian that goes la 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 la?" So, I grew up with that around me. We faced a lot of racism, a lot of prejudices. my parents we were at a time where for them it was all about assimilation. It wasn't about retaining your identity, retaining your traditions. It was more about, can we assimilate? How can we assimilate so that we are not always pointed to, looked at, laughed at, chased down the street? So that was how I grew up. So for me, the idea and the notion of tradition was a very contentious one, really contentious for me. We had a few friends who were Indian, probably not all Hindus, just all over, whatever you could find, we connected with. We ate in Taco Bell. Pizza Hut was our vegetarian outings, so it was a tradition. It was like growing up with you being the outsider, you being the person who was always looked at as very different, people who could not pronounce our names, so we almost had to forego that whole idea of tradition just to become an American in the 1970s. And in the mid-70s, early to mid-70s too. It wasn't even like late 70s where a lot of the second wave of immigration happened for a lot of South Asians. So I didn't grow up with religion. I did not grow up with Indian dance. My first foray as a 4-year-old or 5-year-old moving this country was in ballet. I studied ballet for about 6 years as a kid. I gave it up, then I came back to it. And I did jazz dance. I did lots of other things that were very Western. So I found Indian dance later in my life. And I think what drew me to this idea of this Indian, I saw it as a child and I was like in love with the costume. Obviously I didn't understand anything else about it. But what drew me to the art was the fact that I didn't have to cover up who I was. Like I just felt there's something so beautiful about this. I don't know what as a child drew me to it, and then it persisted when I when I was in high school, when I was in college. It's when I kind of just more found teachers that I could work with. Eventually in New York City, they weren't the best teachers at that time, but there were people I could work with. I found a pride in myself as a South Asian in this country, having grown up trying to just not be different. But what drew me most to our art form was the expressive nature of the art. And I think I needed that outlet. I needed that. So at first it was like, okay, I'm all in. I want to just learn it. I want to be very classical. I want to be very traditional. I don't care, So I did that for a while, and I wanted to be a Bharatanatyam dancer. I wanted to go to India and study, and I wanted to just be part of that culture because I had, negated it for so long in my life. And then eventually through years, you're just influenced by everything. I'm an American. I am an Indian American. I'm a South Asian American. I am exposed to so many things. I'm influenced by so many things. So that found its way into my voice, into my artistic practice. And for a while I was kind of like, okay, I wanted to open myself up, but now I'm feeling the urge because this is who I am. This is where I am. I'm in New York City. I'm surrounded. I've seen art, for many, many years here, and it's finding its way into my expressiveness, and I think I'm very open to it. So for me, tradition is, again, what is tradition? It's fluid, I didn't grow up with tradition, so tradition is really it's an evolutionary process, both societally and personally for me. So that, I think that's my experience, which is probably a little bit different from Nadhi and Preeti's as well.
I'm just going to take off from where Sonali stopped. It's true that tradition is something I grew up that's ever evolving. Because it's something that's not ossified, but I think the way we express it can be quite different from each other. I think that traditional forms versus tradition, traditional form lives by a certain codification and rules and grammar, whereas a tradition is something that keeps continuously evolving through generations and modifies itself based on modern customs. If I were to think of my growing up with my grandparents and my great grandparents, I always find that I'm just a continuum. I'm in that continuum. I'm now carrying that torch to give to my daughter. if you would ask my daughter what I am, she'd probably say I'm quite traditional. But she continued the tradition, so I never think of myself as traditional, But she's of a different generation. Her views of the world are quite different. And the same way, I sort of grew up too. When I look at tradition, the word called tradition through creative practice and creative world, I always think that is something that, it's like a little stamp that we carry with us. We're sort of born in a certain way and brought up in a certain way, and we express ourselves in a certain way. And the chosen path for me is the performing arts. And you carry that with you. And that to me, it's a more sort of a fun place to see what does it mean to you now in your life, and what it means now could be very different from 5 years from now. So there's a sort of, for me, there's an individual identity with the traditions I carry, and certain sort of customs that I took for granted when I was young, and what I question now in my life through just experience and not continuing to live in India. So having lived in different parts of the world, you sort of look at many different practices too, and you look to see how people respond to their storytelling, and that in turn becomes like a mirror to your own. Through my own contemporary works, I would say that my research and my sort of delving into my exploration into my tradition of dance probably has gone much deeper than I did when I was performing classical repertoires, because there were many things that I just went along with. I loved I loved being a performer. I loved dancing. I just loved being on stage, and when my teachers gave me the pieces to perform, and just the sheer joy of performance, and being in the tradition of performance and the audience was enough for me at that time. It was wonderful. It was just like a little candy store. But then you start paying attention to what the candies are made of, and then you want to start making your own recipes. And I don't think you can make your own recipe until you actually know where those roots come from. So to me, those kind of that's where for me the word kind of tradition comes in, particularly with creativity, and where you take it forward. But what I do sort of hesitate, the area I hesitate to go into is into the area of becoming a cultural torchbearer. I'm an artist. I'm not a cultural torchbearer. So I am a concentrate of the community and society I live in, and therefore like a medium. And to then be didactic about it, or to tell people what is Indian or what is not Indian, I just feel that is not part of my story. It's something that I just let others do if they need to. But I think as an artist, my quest for seeking my own voice through time should be strong enough to form an inquiry into people who observe it or watch it or want to engage with conversation. It's to provoke thought. And I think any tradition can be alive through time if it provokes the right kind of thought.
I love hearing both of you, all of you talk. This is already so exciting. I mean, for me, the word tradition has been kind of a scary word, because I've heard people use it in not so nice ways, and in the sense of that's not traditional, like, and especially early on in my career when I maybe was more sensitive to what people said about my work. That's not traditional, but that's not classical. Or talking about another dancer or another work, that person's not doing classical. I mean, looks fine. Looks like Bharatanatyam to me, and so I feel like in the last maybe 5 or 10 years, which is not very long, like really navigating what tradition means, and when it's used in the context of dance, especially with grants and with presenters, and me actually often avoiding the word altogether because it comes with a certain connotation, like Preeti was saying, like, oh, am I a cultural torchbearer, or who really is, especially with the sort of sordid history that Bharatanatyam has in terms of what traditional really means, and sort of learning about that, learning about historical context, which of course is an ongoing process, has really made me hesitant to use that word in the context of my work, or really anyone's work here. I feel like a lot of what we do is contemporary, and the word contemporary is an umbrella for a lot of work that is going on, especially in the US. no matter what kind of costume or, movement vocabulary an artist sort of chooses to explore. And that's where I am today, and tomorrow I might change, but I tend to think about what I guess the tradition of dance gave to me, and what the things I take is that community experience, reflection of our stories, seeing representation, letting our stories occupy the space around us and letting our community see that. And those are the things that I take as traditions that I want to keep. And what that looks like might be different from artist to artist. But I think that's for me really important. And I sometimes use culturally specific, but then I get really nervous about using that as well, because I was born in San Francisco. Like, I speak Malayalam, I don't speak Tamil or any other language. Like, I use that in Bharatanatyam, the dance form that I trained in. I grew up Christian. Like, really, I'm not a traditional Bharatanatyam dancer in that way, but I do believe there is something that we are holding on to from a previous generation and that we're sharing with our community. So I'm having a hard time actually naming that. And I'm just navigating that space now. And I think hopefully an answer will come soon. But I do get nervous when people are like, well, can you wear the traditional costume and dance? And then I'm like, oh no, here we go. Like, what do we do? How do we answer this question? So I think the word tradition is, again, something I'm sorting out.
Yeah, for sure. I think, like all of you said, this is, and I kind of prefaced this too before I asked the question, this is a really big topic. I think it can be like its own episode. So
I agree with Preeti and Nadhi that, tradition is so loaded. And again, it's like when you're considered an Indian classical dancer, you are expected by grantors and presenters and all of that to work within the classical genre or to create works that are kind of considered traditional. I think there's such a misunderstanding of what it means to choreograph in our art forms. The word choreography itself is very misunderstood. I think when you're applying for grants in this country as a classical dancer, or within the idea of creating new works within Bharatanatyam or whatever, they don't understand what it means to create new works in a classical genre. So it's so misunderstood, misrepresented too. And again, cultural torchbearing is not, I think most of us can agree that's not what we are doing this art for. And I think it's such a huge topic. So I just wanted to voice, I love everything that Preeti and Nadhi said.
So, for our experiential activity today, I was hoping we could do some I'm calling it silent storytelling, but basically the idea is it's similar to collaborative storytelling, where we might like alternate saying one word or one sentence at a time, but instead of speaking it, we're going to be just using our hand gestures and mudras from the Indian classical dance vocabulary to sort of create a story together. So I can start, I'll, do the first sentence, and then I can pass it on to maybe Sonali, and then Sonali will do another sentence, kind of continuing from where I left off, and then you'll pass it to Nadhi, and we'll just, I mean, this is very open and free flowing. I think we'll just kind of improvise until we find some closure or somewhat of an end for our story. How does that sound?
I have a question about the game.
Yes.
Do we have to repeat what the previous people said?
No.
Okay.
No. Yeah. Does that feel like the end? I don't know.
Very, very Hollywood ending. I like that.
Yeah. Awesome. How was that activity for you both?
Oh, that was so fun. We should do that. We should do
Yeah,
that.
no, I should do it with my students. It's actually really, is that something that you made up, Aishwarya?
Yeah. So in my previous season of Chai Side Chats, I had a couple of theater artists. So we did this verbally, actually. So we
Yeah.
each said a sentence of, and we created a story together. But since we're all dancers, I thought it would be fun to just kind of explore with movement. But yeah, I also do kind of similar activities with my students when I'm like teaching them Abhinaya. So yeah, I just thought it would be fun.
I've done the theater exercise, and I do it with my kids for fun sometimes too, because it's like it requires a lot of that spontaneous thinking. But we've never done it with mudras, so that's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's fun.
Yeah, and I think it's cool. Like, I mean, just a shout out to all my viewers. Hopefully, you all were able to follow along with the story. I think.
Should we tell them the story?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can like sort of give a synopsis if you weren't able to follow along. So we started off with going into the forest. That's what I started off with, and then like a girl going into the forest, and then I think Sonali, you added the bird and the
I added
lion or tiger.
she saw the tiger, she was scared, then she saw the bird and she was like full of wonder about the bird and then
Yeah, and then I said, well, can you do something about the tiger? I asked the bird if it could do something about the tiger. And then
and then they had like a little bit of like the bird tried to go towards the tiger and the tiger was like, nope, I'm the king of the jungle. Like you don't belong here. This is my land. And then like Sonali said, a little bit of a Hollywood ending with let's just live together harmoniously.
Sonali said, well, I'm a bird, I can fly really high, and you got nothing on me, type of thing.
yeah, you can't rule over me. I can go up in the sky and then Nadhi said
I could climb. I'm also awesome.
I can climb up, I'll get you, and then you said that we're all together, let's live harmoniously together.
Yeah. So if you didn't follow along, that was kind of our short story that we created. But yeah, that brings us to the end of the episode. But I wanted to thank you for being here. I'm sad that Preeti couldn't be part of this exercise, but it was really fun doing it with you both. So yeah, thanks so much for being on this episode. And yeah, wishing you all the best with whatever work you have coming up this year. I will drop more information about your websites and other like social media handles and stuff in the description so our viewers can learn more about you and your work.
Hello viewers, I hope you enjoyed this roundtable episode of Chai Side Chats with Sonali, Preeti, and Nadhi. Please do like, share, and subscribe to the Creativity Awakening YouTube channel for regular updates on videos. If you want to get more exclusive sneak peeks into our episodes and the creative process here at Chai Side Chats, you can follow our pages on social media that are linked in the description below. Stay tuned, the next episode of Chai Side Chats is coming soon.